The Scream Kings are in no way responsible for any encounters with the paranormal, extraterrestrial abductions, eldritch insanity, hauntings, curses, hexes, demonic possessions, cryptozoological sightings, or any loss of sleep that may result from listening to this podcast.
This is the Scream Kings podcast. This is Max, George.
And I'm Nathaniel Darkish.
And I'm Brett Odom.
Come listen to us, the children of the night. What podcasts we make. Okay, well, I guess first things first, you listening at home heard that we have a wonderful guest today, Brett Odom. So, Brett, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit? Talk about maybe how you found out about Scream Kings and why you're here?
Well, I found out about it through being friends with Max. I am a PhD student in political science, but a classic movie buff because you have to watch something to cope with the terror that is grad school. Far scarier than any movie, let me tell you. But classic movies are my jam, and I am particularly a lover of the classic horror and early suspense films, way back in the classic Hollywood and silent eras. And so that is how I got harangued to come on here.
All right, and then I guess along those lines, what are some of your favorite horror movies or just kind of favorite horror media in general? It doesn't have to be the classics, but it can be.
Yeah. No, I am, like I said, I'm a huge classic movie buff, so like, I'm not like a straight up horror guy. I like suspense films, so the older, some of the older films that still have that real good suspense quality are some of my favorites in the genre. Dracula and the Wolfman are just classic monsters. Gaslight is still one of the best suspense movies you'll ever watch in any age. Contemporarily, Silence of the Lambs is one of my favorites.
All right, awesome.
Silence of the Lambs is a favorite of the podcast. We absolutely adore that show.
And I may be staring at a Hannibal Lecter pop figure right now.
Make sure he's been fed.
Well, it's okay. He has the mask, so he can't really.
Oh, good.
So for today's podcast, we kind of wanted to do something a little bit different where Halloween is just around the corner, or if you're a purist, Samhain, or any of the other Halloween names that you can think of. All Hallows
Eve. Jinx.
We wanted to take it back a little bit and kind of talk about some of the origins of the classic monsters, which is why we brought Brett along here for this podcast, is because a lot of these monsters started as movies, really, which have now created a myriad and myriad of other movies, which some are fantastic, some are not.
Absolutely. And I mean, I guess a lot of them started out as books, to clarify, and then became early films and then have been adapted and readapted and readapted. So, yeah, definitely a lot of the big roots of the horror genre, especially in film, are going to be, firmly found in the movies we're talking about today. So, I guess just to kick things off, Brett was going to talk about Nosferatu.
Yeah, and picking up on that theme, you really do see how the movies affected our perception of these monsters with Nosferatu and later Dracula. Just in the 10 years there, you can see the change that cinema is wrought to these characters or creatures. Nosferatu is the 1921 silent film classic, directed by F.W. Murnau, starring Max Schreck as the titular Nosferatu, named Count Orlok. This is a unlicensed adaptation of Dracula, which is really the birth of what most of us think of the modern vampire story. When you put it into the context of this film, though, it was made in post-war Germany. It's the only film this studio ever made. And so you get a lot of expressionist, dark romantic, lots of establishing nature shots that make everything seem creepy. A really grotesque monster who rises out of the crypt. This is not, like we will see 10 years later from Bela Lugosi, a suave and gentlemanly vampire. This is a monstrous creature still. Because a lot of people are familiar with the Dracula story. In this movie, though, because it's an unlicensed adaptation, all the names are different. So Dracula is Count Orlok, Jonathan Harker is named Hutter, Mina is Ellen. They're Itzin to Van Helsing in this movie. So it's its own unique story while still feeling a lot like Dracula. In short, it starts the way it always does. A young man is sent off to Transylvania to finalize a property deal with Count Orlok. The villagers are terrified, and the idiot goes anyway, because he has to go finish the property deal, despite the fact that everyone is telling him he's doing a deal with a vampire. He finds a book, and that's where the exposition in the silent film comes from. He reads the book, and it tells him all about the terrifying monster that awaits in the castle that he has now walked into.
Is it a terrifying monster, or is he just misunderstood?
Oh no, he's terrifying. And that is like one of the cool things about this film. It's 1921, but Count Orlok is still creepy as hell. Yeah. The way Max Schreck very intentionally and very deliberately moves slowly, like a living corpse, something that's reflected in a lot of the early vampire portrayals. And then because you've got this very strong German expressionist influence, all of his features have been very elongated and made into monsters. Although it does look like his fangs are like little toothpicks sticking out of his mouth. It's 1921. What can you say? But there is this iconic scene though, where it's like, yeah, it's 1921, so do all the horror thrills hold up like they do today? No, but there's this iconic scene where Orlok he's made the property deal. Hutter is in the castle and just kind of realizing what's going on, and Orlok reveals himself in his full terrifying monster, just slowly proceeding toward the hall. Basically, just playing with his food, really, just tormenting Hutter with the demonic nature that is him, and he just moves down this hallway in slow motion, but ever inching closer. The door swings open on its own. It's creepy as hell. All the while back home, Ellen, Hutter's wife, is like having these nightmarish visions of her husband and his fate. He does fortunately escape because Orlok goes off to Germany to this house that he's bought. Hutter returns home. Orlok has brought the plague with him. People are dying. People are being victims. But Ellen realizes from reading the book that Hutter had that a woman who is pure of heart can distract the vampire with her beauty and therefore seduce him out of his coffin until daylight breaks, which will kill him. And that's exactly what happens. She sacrifices herself, makes herself vulnerable to Orlok, who can't resist the pure maiden that is Ellen. And while he drinks her blood, he realizes the sun has come up and he dies. Hutter embraces his wife as she dies, and the movie ends with the smoldering ruins of the vampire.
Those crafty women and their curves.
Well, it's such a this movie in a lot of ways, the basic elements of the Dracula story are there that we think of from the book and from the 1931 movie with Bela Lugosi. But Ellen is probably the biggest difference in the movie in a lot of ways because she has real agency. Like, she makes this decision where Mina, at least in the other classic era vampire movies, she has no agency. She's just there to be preyed on by Dracula. But Ellen here, she strikes the killing blow against him by sacrificing herself.
Yeah, that's definitely very forward-thinking, especially for that time period.
Yeah, it's both forward-thinking and not, because what it's coming from is this German expressionist, dark romantic perspective where beauty was pure. It was a reflection of the inner self, just like Orlok is a terrifying demonic creature, and it is reflected in how he looks, this iconic demon they created for the movie. So it's really a very old school notion of beauty that this, like you would see back from way back in the early 1800s with the Romantics. But whereas that's a kind of a good place to transition from it. You skip ahead 10 years, and beauty's no longer the defining feature of the good characters. It's the defining feature of Dracula. You see this transition in the movies here from these two films, from the vampire as monstrous to the vampire as seductive. And that's, you can just extrapolate from there to Twilight. Vampires become hot and sexy and desirable. But unlike Edward, these vampires are not redeemable. These are villains. They are evil. Dracula in either movie is evil. There's not a redeeming bone in his body. The difference is, whereas he's killed by beauty in Nosferatu, when you look in Dracula at Bela Lugosi, as I'm transitioning here, Bela Lugosi's Dracula hides behind beauty. Beauty is something that is seductive and deceptive. So very big transition there in the themes. And part of that has to do with the movie in 31 is we're moved from a German film to an English film. It is based on a play that is based on the book. And of course it stars, pardon my language, but Bela fucking Lugosi. The man is a leading man. He's got those Hungarian good looks. He was a leading man before this movie, which typecasted him as Dracula.
And plus those eyes.
Oh, those eyes. He's just gorgeous. Like, there's a reason he's seductive. It's Bela Lugosi. Of course you'd be seduced by him. But like Max Schreck did, he gave his portrayal, you still see this very notion of the vampires as living corpses. Everything Bela Lugosi does is very deliberate. It's very slow. Even the way he speaks is very slow. Like, he famously greets Renfield at his castle, one of the opening scenes, and says, "I bid you welcome. I am Dracula." Everything he does is that kind of slow, measured dialogue. And it's the definitive portrayal. Every single Dracula movie you have seen since this movie is standing in Bela Lugosi's shoes. They're all just trying to interpret him, the character, through the lens of Bela Lugosi. You can even see that in the 1990s movie that tried to be more closer to the book. Even then, a lot of it is, you could just say, "Yep, that's Bela Lugosi." And part of this has to do with, this is now Hollywood taking over the character. This is Hollywood meets theater, whereas the earlier one was still part of that German expressionist movement in the silent film era. The same thing that gave us other creepy films like The Golem or The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which are these other very creepy suspense films from the silent era. They really relied on a lot of those same techniques. The Dracula story is very similar in Dracula to Nosferatu. But now we've got some extra characters, and the story gets filled out to more what we think of often when we think of the story. A man named Renfield instead of Harker, or instead of our main character, Renfield goes off to complete the lease. And he, unlike the main character Nosferatu, he doesn't make it out of this in one piece. He is bitten and succumbs to Dracula. He becomes Dracula's hypnotized servant, practically. A vampire himself, but one who only wants to prey on small lives, and he's been promised by Dracula that if he will help him, Dracula will guarantee that he has small lives to feed on.
Yeah, and that does, to clarify, that does pull from the original book, but it kind of rolled his character and Harker's characters together.
Yeah, and that's something, and it's and something you see more in the 90s movie, where they really did a better job of pulling these apart, whereas Harker in this Dracula movie, he never gets anywhere close. He's only in the story in London. So everything that happens in the castle gets bottled up into Renfield. But this is, from this moment, Dracula is creeping out Renfield. Like I said, I bid you welcome. This is the famous. He hears a howl and goes, "Listen to them, children of the night. What music they make." And tells him that the blood is the life, Mr. Renfield. These are all semi-cheesy lines because they're famous now, but they're still creepy the way he delivers them in this haunted castle filled with spider webs. it's like you just know that this is bad. This is a bad place, and Renfield is in for a bad time. And indeed, he does. Like I said, Renfield completes the purchase, and only to get the fangs himself, becomes a vampire. They arrive in London on a ship that Dracula has killed the whole crew of. That's actually done explicitly in Nosferatu, and this happens all off screen here in Dracula. All that's left is Renfield laughing maniacally with this really bizarre and creepy laughter as they find him. I'm doing my best impressions here. Just roll with it.
It was beautiful.
Thank you. But this is where the story begins to take form again. Is they get to London. Dracula is now like, fresh meat. This is where you get the famous Dracula killing the flower girl scene. Dracula meets our cast of characters: Dr. Seward, who owns the insane asylum, his daughter Mina, her fiance Harker, their friend Lucy. Lucy promptly is killed by Dracula. But all these characters who in Nosferatu in the book are more confrontational with Dracula, it's really only Van Helsing in this movie who takes full stage as Dracula's opponent, and he arrives after Lucy's death as our exposition machine, telling us what's going on, what is a vampire, and all those things. And around this time, Mina starts to have nightmares, and the bite marks appear, and it becomes clear that Dracula is feeding on her. Harker, her fiancé, is an idiot and in constant denial of what is going on despite everything, and tries to take Mina away. But Van Helsing has quickly realized that it's Dracula, since he does not appear in a mirror. You get these iconic scenes where Dracula and Van Helsing square off against each other. This is where you get the full eye effect, where Bela Lugosi famously raises his eyebrows to try to hypnotize his victims, and tries to force Van Helsing to come to him, and Van Helsing has a strong mind and resists. In the end, you get to the climax where Dracula takes Mina. He wants to make her a vampire like himself, a new bride. The Scooby Gang follows Renfield to the old abbey where Dracula has taken refuge. Dracula kills Renfield, and before he can actually finish the job, though, on Mina, the sun has come up and he must take shelter, so Van Helsing and Harker are able to stake him and free Mina from her spell, and everyone lives happily ever after. The fact that it is happily ever after is one of the many interesting comparisons to Nosferatu and vampire stories in general. This is a creepy monster who has been feeding on people, but at the end of the day, our heroine gets to live, and our hero, they get to go off and be happily ever after and marry. Whereas in Nosferatu, Ellen dies at the end. It isn't happily ever after. There is a cost to defeating the vampire. I mentioned that we see this transition here from monstrous of Count Orlok to the seductive Bela Lugosi Dracula. One's killed by beauty, the other hides behind it. But neither is a sympathetic character. There is no complexity to these vampires. These are just evil creatures. And that's something that really distinguishes, I think, these early vampire films from, say, the werewolf films that we're going to talk about in a bit. They're not exploring the complexity of human psychology. They're not exploring the complexity of morality like Frankenstein does. This is really just straight up about humans, how we respond to evil. And you get people like Renfield who succumb to it. Van Helsing and then in Nosferatu, Hutter and Ellen, they resist it. And then in Dracula, you get a whole different category of people like Harker and Seward who are just in constant denial about the nature of the evil that is staring them in the face and, standing in their parlor. And that's remains a pretty powerful theme in vampires, I think, because it's easy to make them just straight up evil. These are demons who feed on the living in order to live. It's seems more of a conscious choice than compared to some of the other creatures that are the classic universal canon. But both of these films, though, at the end of the day, define the modern vampire, either in the form of its monstrous version, like Nosferatu directly inspired the Master in Buffy, the first season vampire villain from that show. Almost every version of Dracula on screen since Bela Lugosi has been more the seductive gentleman. So Christopher Lee, Gary Oldman, they're just walking in Bela Lugosi's shoes. And hell, even Mel Brooks made a Dracula Dead and Loving It, which was a direct riff off Bela Lugosi's film. Interestingly, one final note about the legacy issue. Nosferatu is a legacy that's an accident. Like I mentioned, this was an unauthorized adaptation, and so Bram Stoker's estate sued and got the film shut down, and it ordered every print destroyed, and one survived because it had been taken internationally for distribution. And so it was painstakingly copied and cared for by an early cult following. It's actually one of the earliest examples of a cult film. And that is the only reason we have Nosferatu, is that it was this devoted following of fans of this creepy vampire terrorizing a German town. Guaranteed that it survived until the modern day.
That's amazing. I had no idea about that with the movie.
Yeah, it's like, either way, we would have had Bela Lugosi's legacy here, and we would have therefore indirectly have had Nosferatu, but the reason we still are able to have this very visually stunning silent film is largely just to the devotion of horror movie fans and monster movie fans who wouldn't let it die. It's perhaps fitting that the Undead Creature film was kind of the undead limping forward through the century that followed.
Yeah, so I guess what really strikes me about these films is just the performances of those two leading actors, who are playing these titular characters. Not only did they have the right look for the characters, but their performances, kind of like you've referenced, are very deliberate and very effective, even if other parts of the films may have been lacking in certain ways. But I love that Max Schreck famously is only seen blinking in the film like once or twice for Nosferatu, or that Bela Lugosi, just all of his performance was just so polished and debonair that it even stands up to other great horror films from that same era that he was in, like White Zombie. I feel like this was a stronger example of just how skilled of an actor he is.
Oh yeah, and I think you see that in the moments where Dracula breaks from that sophisticated mold, because it is an act. Like I said, it's like whereas beauty kills the vampire in Nosferatu, it's what he hides behind in Dracula. And you can see, like, when Van Helsing notices there's no reflection, he asks for Dracula to help him with something. I have just seen a curious phenomenon, so curious I doubt my own senses. It's like, anything I can do. And he opens this cigar box that has a mirror on it, and Dracula just snarls and smashes it to the ground, suddenly breaking from that debonair persona. And you can see Bela Lugosi acting there on full display, not just because he broke it, but then as Dracula very painfully and forcefully forces himself back into that classy gentleman persona, and just very stiffly says, "My apologies, Dr. Seward. I dislike mirrors. Van Helsing will explain." And he walks out. And it's just this brilliant moment of acting, because everything else has been so measured, and for this one moment you get to see the ferocity that's underneath it. It's just brilliant.
One thing that I don't like about the films nearly as much is kind of what's been referenced, that it is a fairly sizable departure from a lot of the key elements of the book. The book is one of my all-time favorites, and so I'm kind of a purist. I'm of the opinion that it really hasn't been well adapted to my satisfaction ever. And so I think it's really interesting to see how I felt like, especially with Dracula, that the film adaptation, because it rolls so many characters together, it's one very short. It's just clocks in at probably like 70 minutes or so. Feel like it definitely could have been a little bit longer to explore the original content more. And two, I was kind of just underwhelmed with the performances of pretty much everyone besides Bela Lugosi, and also just because there's like any lack of like there's such a lack of I mean part of me recognizes that like the pacing is very different at this point in time versus kind of what we see in a modern film. But I have to admit that while I was watching it, there were parts where I was just kind of bored, and certainly my attention was brought back when there were those amazing scenes like the mirror scene you referenced, or just anything where Bela Lugosi was really kind of showing the height of his powers as an actor. But a lot of the other scenes, I just kind of didn't care.
And I think a lot of the pace, at least the pacing side of things, comes from the fact that whereas Nosferatu was directly adapting the material, Dracula's it's indirect because it is actually adapting it based on a play. So it's already one step removed from the book, because its source material is a stage version. And I think a lot of the pacing of the film, and definitely the way it is filmed, it tends to be ensemble shots. The rooms in which they are filmed are very much like a stage, and I think that's very clear when you watch the film. It is filming it in the context of how do we produce this for an audience, and a lot of the actors, even because that woodenness that a lot of the actors have that on stage would not necessarily be bad, because what they're doing is they're projecting out into an audience and having to be heard, but comes across on film as just utterly wooden and lacking. Also possibly just a case of it's the 1930s and they're still figuring out how to do talkies.
Yeah, that's fair.
And I would agree with Brett on that. It's easy to look at these old films and kind of judge them. And I don't want to say judge, but maybe critique them on kind of what we're used to now. But again, like Brett mentioned, there were a lot of other factors going into the creations of these movies that may have been a factor in some of that boredom you see.
That said, I mean, partially, I guess, because Bela Lugosi is so central to the film, I think it's still eminently watchable today. A lot of the London people, the Sewards, the Minas, the Lucys, they're flattered characters. They're not very well developed. But the movie is saved not just by Bela Lugosi, but by Renfield especially. I think the guy who plays Renfield steals the show. Whenever he's in a room, he's just tortured and insane. Van Helsing he's a little flatter than the other two, but he still has great screen presence in his confrontations with Dracula. So I would this is of the Universal monster movies, it is probably my favorite. So just one of the reasons that I'm the one talking about it. But I think the people who stand out in it save the movie for sure.
That's totally fair. So I guess last thing want to hit on this would just be kind of how you rank it in terms of the screams and crowns. So how scary is it, and how good is it as a film in general?
Okay,
for both of the films.
Yeah, so Nosferatu I'd say is 6 screams. It's still a creepy movie. The German expressionists still make that influence is still there, and it's just makes everything kind of creepy in the movie. I'd give it 7 crowns. If anything, I think it suffers more than Dracula from this old slow pacing of films. But it's still an enjoyable film. If I'm partial to silent films myself, so I very much enjoy it. Dracula, I would say, is only 4 screams. It's not. While Bela Lugosi manages some real moments of creepiness, it's not a movie. It is a movie that has survived for the iconicness of its monster and not the scariness of its monster. But that said, I give it a full 10 crowns. It's one of my favorite movies. I think it's just Bela Lugosi acts it out of the park, and it's just still a classic of cinema, period.
All right, and I guess I'm gonna just throw in my rating. So I've only seen clips of Nosferatu. I haven't watched it all the way through. I'm gonna remedy that very soon. But for Dracula, I'd probably give it 3 screams, and I'm gonna give it 7 crowns just because of the boredom that I mentioned. Though, yeah, the parts that I liked, I really liked. So it's kind of hard to rate something like that when it's kind of a mixed reaction to it, like I had.
So for Nosferatu on my end, I would probably give it a 7 screams. Nosferatu really inspired a lot of future demon movies, and I think his makeup is just terrifying. You know, that idea is very prevalent nowadays still in horror, and it really, I think, stands to the quality of the horror. 5 is probably a crowns for me on that one. And then for Dracula, again, yeah, it's not super scary. I'd probably give it a 4. But I think it's a classic. I love the Dracula movie, so I'm going to go with a 6 on the crowns.
All right. Well, so I guess let's transition into another Universal monster movie of right around that same period of time, Frankenstein. And I'm going to take the lead on this one. So Frankenstein, I guess I'm just going to come out, as stating, very clearly, it's not a good adaptation of Frankenstein.
And I believe it's pronounced Frankenstein for all my Mel Gibson fans.
But yeah, so Frankenstein, it didn't do a good job of adapting the source material faithfully. But I do feel like it does hit on some of the key themes and points of the original book. But that said, regardless of how well it adapts the source material, I personally find it to be a phenomenal film. So I guess just the first thing that kind of really, I guess I'll just do kind of a basic plot summary. Dr. Frankenstein wants to create life after death. He does so with Frankenstein's monster, and then Frankenstein's monster escapes and begins terrorizing the countryside, largely inadvertently because he just looks kind of scary. From there, after an incident where he goes and tries to befriend a little girl who is being really nice to him, but he doesn't know how to behave himself around her, he accidentally kills her, and that results in a angry mob coming and hunting him down and ultimately burning down the windmill in which he is trying to hide from them in. And that's the, I guess, 10-second summary. But what really strikes me about this film is how, I guess, one, how eminently watchable it is. I felt like it didn't suffer from a lot of the same issues that I had with Dracula. I felt like the pacing was more continuously, I don't know, something was happening, and just the performance of Boris Karloff is just something else. I guess for most of my life I'd seen a lot of parodies of Frankenstein. Young Frankenstein comes to mind specifically, which I think is a phenomenal phenomenal parody that does so much to very cleverly play off of the original source material. But a lot of times when you see Frankenstein's monster, it's very wooden and uninteresting and just some dude who's sticking his arms out and going a lot. Karloff has so much subtlety in his performance, like his facial expressions. You can feel his confusion and his pain and his, I don't know, just everything. It's such an incredible performance. Like if there were the Oscars back then, I think he should have definitely won, Best Actor for his performance, because he is just so tremendous in that film. So I guess other points I want to hit on, some things that kind of surprised me about the film. One, there's just no character named Igor in it. In that, or in the subsequent film, which I'm going to touch on, Bride of Frankenstein. The scientist's assistant is not Igor. I can't remember the character's name actually, but that didn't come in until later, until I believe the Hammer film era. And I will say that one of the weaknesses of the film is that Dr. Frankenstein is kind of uninteresting. He just is very theatrically shouting, I'm gonna be this great creator of, and I'm gonna be God, and that's true to the character, but I feel like he kind of maybe overplayed it a little bit. But I feel like any of the flaws of the film are just made up for entirely by Boris Karloff and his incredible performance.
I mean, it's Boris Karloff. He's we don't have people like him anymore. Where did they go?
I mean, I say that every time I watch a film from this period of time. It's like, where are our Humphrey Bogarts? Where are our Claude Rains? Hollywood, you just need to shut up shop. You're not doing any better than you've done back in these days. I'm gonna be honest. I think Frankenstein suffers from that slow pacing issue. I think of Dracula as a little more, personally, but Boris is just every scene he's in is just you're just brilliant, and more than makes up for any of those old pacing issues.
And for me, the Frankenstein kind of monster himself never really scared me. Like, Nosferatu has that very intimidating presence. Werewolves that we'll be going into, there's a lot of these transformation scenes that are pretty grotesque and horrific. Frankenstein has never really scared me in that way.
Yeah, I would say that he's not necessarily a scary character for conventional reasons. And I would argue that really the monster of the film is Frankenstein, the doctor himself.
That's a valid point.
Because he is so self-obsessed and wants to prove himself as this god of a man, that he creates something that he doesn't understand and doesn't really care that that suddenly there's this creature that's out there that is essentially mentally a baby in a lot of ways in this incredibly powerful body, and so it just doesn't know how to control itself. It's I don't know, the character of Frankenstein's monster is just so tragic. I don't find him scary. I just find him really sad, because he genuinely wants to just find something to find some love or compassion in the world. And he finds that with the famous scene with the blind man, where he goes and is helping this blind man, and then when the blind man's family comes, they all freak out, and he ends up running away, and there's the fear of the fire and all that. But yeah, I mean, he's afraid of everything and is just confused by everything. I mean, Frankenstein is a monster, but also just kind of the way that people react to something other is also one of the big monstrosities of the film. And so, yeah, it's definitely not a conventional horror story in that, we're not. It's not like society versus a monster. It's basically that society and science are kind of the monsters, and the quote unquote monster is actually the most sympathetic character. And so I guess kind of going along with that, I find the subsequent film, The Bride of Frankenstein, really interesting. One, it partially just because of how the story's presented. They kind of take a step back and are like, okay, so how are we going to have a sequel? Because at the end of the first film, it seems pretty clear that Frankenstein's monster is killed. But then they decide to kind of play with expectations, and so it starts out with a conversation between Mary Shelley as a character and someone else at the home that she's in, and she's and they're like, oh, like like your last story was so tragic and moving. Like what else could possibly happen? And she's like, oh well, let me tell you what happens next. And so then it's kind of like a frame story that's pinning in the subsequent story, where it's then that he survives and wants a mate, which does kind of also pull from the source material. And so then he goes and he hunts down Dr. Frankenstein and basically takes his wife to be his mate. He kills her, and then she is revived using the scientific process that Dr. Frankenstein uses, and becomes the mate of the creature. Is what she's referred to in the credits when she's not playing Mary Shelley, because it's the same actress. But basically, she is also just so horrified of Frankenstein's monster that she kills herself. So it's also really depressing ending. But I have to say that Elsa Lanchester, however you pronounce her name, her performance matches Karloff's in terms of just powerful subtlety, especially just like the acting that she does with her face, like her facial expressions, is just amazing. But I find it really interesting because, one, Frankenstein is widely considered to be the first science fiction novel. It's kind of the birth of that genre, and so it's really cool to see how this isn't that we're dealing with monsters that have been around for a long time, or that are arriving from natural means, but rather these are man-made monsters. This is the birth of the mad scientist, the kind of the powers that technology and science potentially wield, and the horrible impacts that those could potentially have on the world.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a good distinction. We associate Frankenstein with all the other horror monsters, but I think in his birth, it's like what you mentioned. He's more of a science fiction story rather than a classical horror.
Yeah, and there's definitely real horror there, but once again, it really kind of boils down to the horror is looking at how we treat this other thing that is essentially innocent, rather than from any of the specific monstrosity of the creature.
Sure.
I find it so interesting with the Bride of Frankenstein. You mentioned that they took that somewhat from the source material, but of course, in the novel of Frankenstein, when he is being forced to make this bride for the creature, he never finishes it. He destroys it rather than finish it. That's what leads to the creature's murder of his fiancée and remaining family members in the book. And so the movie takes that and asks what happens if he doesn't finish it. And in doing so, creates this whole really unique and in its own right iconic story about what happens next in the story. Because it's like you said, it's like the bride itself is terrified of the creature. It finds him repulsive, and that completely unique storyline has held pretty true. Anytime people come back to tell this story, I'm thinking most noticeably in Kenneth Branagh's mid-90s or late 90s Frankenstein adaptation. They squeezed in the Bride of Frankenstein story and did that part, even though they were very explicitly trying to make a movie more based on the book. They couldn't bring themselves to do that part of the story without it. That the creature himself must by that point be so atrocious that the bride will reject. Also, the bride was just in that movie was rejecting herself because it was like, "What have you done to me, Victor?" But it's one of those interesting notions of, I think it brings it back. This in many ways, though, it does bring the story back to this question of what Shelley was getting at, which is what happens when we can't control. What happens when we don't think about what our science can do? And I think that's a way of bringing it back is when when it's like, all right, well, we've done this science and we've done this science, and can't even stand each other. It's like you've created this terrifying mixture of things. And I think in a lot of ways the Bride of Frankenstein brings it back to that notion about science.
Yeah, and I think that it's kind of interesting how, because it is a departure from the source material, that it kind of has a sort of different conclusion, that the monsters can't even stand each other. While in the original book, the reason that he doesn't finish making, his creature a bride is because he fears what would happen. He fears that they would create basically a race of super beings that would, essentially result in the end of the human race, because there would be a superior creature out there. Which, I mean, one speaks to his ego, that he's such a great creator of life that he made something better than even what God made. But two, I think it's just, it's kind of a different conclusion where, he's saying, oh, like maybe there is a limit to what should be done, while in the film Bride of Frankenstein, I almost feel like it's saying, maybe the reaction of, what will result will kind of undo what has been done. But yeah, so I guess, should we launch into the screams and crowns for this one? Fantastic. So I would give this movie, so I guess I'm going to give them probably the same rating. So Screams, 4. There's some pretty intense moments, some pretty creepy moments, but as a whole, it's not especially scary. But then as far as crowns go, I'm going to give both of them an 8. They're both really well done films. I feel like the cinematography is, ahead of its time. I feel like the performances of those two lead actors is just such, just on such another level that I can't help but really, really love both of those films.
I can't justify giving them an 8. I would probably go 6 as far as the crowns go. I think they're wonderful, wonderful movies, but yeah, 8 just seems really high for me. As far as the screams go, though, I'd probably agree with you, though, around a 3.
Yeah, I'd agree on the screams of being 3 apiece, maybe 4. To Bride, for the bride herself, bumping it up a notch. I would probably only actually give Frankenstein a 5. I personally find it to be, like I said, I think it falls victim to the slow pacing of the movies of that era a little worse. But I'd give Bride, I think, at least 7 on the crown. I think it's actually the stronger of the two films. Boris Karloff's portrayal makes both movies just fantastic. So even with that, I will say Boris Karloff forever.
Yeah.
And it does have to be said, of course, that the voice of the Grinch, the narrator anyway, who The Grinch Who Stole Christmas, is Boris Karloff. So we get to have him this entire time of the year, from Halloween to Christmas. We can enjoy the performances of Boris Karloff.
Yeah, and if you want something a little bit lighter fare, then you can also pick up like Arsenic and Old Lace, which, I mean, is a dark comedy that features him kind of making fun of himself. So
I forgot he was in that.
Oh, that movie's so good.
Classic.
It's wonderful. It's what I want to be like when I'm an old person. A murderer.
All right. So should we launch into our last set of Universal classic horror with the Wolfman?
Yeah, so I did something a little bit different than both of you guys. Obviously I did some research on the Wolfman itself, but knowing me, I really dived deep into kind of the mythos of werewolves and where they actually began and kind of where they started and where we are now with them. So I didn't dive deep into the Wolfman like you guys did with Nosferatu or the Frankenstein, so don't hate me. Something, though, that was fascinating and intriguing to me was, we think of werewolves coming from this not coming from this movie, but kind of their hallmark in cinema from the 1941 movie Wolfman. However, there were two movies prior to 1941 that really kind of laid the foundation for werewolf movies, and one of them was Lost in a Fire. So we don't have access to it. It was a 1913 silent film titled The Werewolf. But in 1924, there was a big fire at the studios where it was housed, and all the film was destroyed, which kind of blows my mind a little bit. You don't think of movies being lost to history nowadays. It's kind of a foreign idea. But after that 1924 fire, we got the 1935 movie A Werewolf in London. And this was really kind of the first movie that ushered in this idea of this werewolf cinema, which eventually led to the movie in 1941, The Wolf Man. And as far as the movie goes, it's not my favorite. However, I do have to give a big shout out to the guy who did all of the makeup, Jack Pierce, because the special effects of the Wolfman himself are insane for the time. I mean, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. I don't know. Have you guys seen The Wolfman? Do you have any opinions on the makeup that they did?
It's fantastic. They define. I mean, it's kind of like Bela Lugosi all over again. It's like every werewolf since this movie is just doing Lon Chaney Jr.
And so after the 1941 film, it kind of ushered in this idea of the werewolf, and a lot different from vampires, and kind of how, Brett, you mentioned earlier that they're just the epitome of evil. There was no real redemption for them early on, and then they kind of became this icon of nefarious beauty. And then even with Frankenstein, how he is this idea of playing God and the tragedy in that, Wolfman really kind of changed the werewolf in that it became this idea of Jekyll and Hyde, that there's this primal kind of rage that we all fight against, and how damaging that can be when it goes unchecked. And this kind of became a metaphor for adolescence and puberty, and how we all kind of go through this primal transformation in our emotions, and if they're not kept in check, they can do a lot of damage. And so a lot of movies regarding werewolves kind of deal with this idea of, I don't want to say split personalities, but the ability...
The duality of man.
Exactly. That humans can do really terrible things, and not because they are supernatural, but because we have this instinctual, animalistic kind of a rage sometimes when our emotions go unchecked, which was really interesting to kind of dive into with a few of these other movies, like Ginger Snaps, which came out in 2000, which relates to two teenage girls who are going through puberty, and the cycle of becoming a werewolf is not tied to the moon, it's tied to the menstruation period, which was a really fun kind of a twist to a story that's been done quite frequently. And another thing that is kind of interesting, to go back to the adolescence, this really kind of broke ground with the 1985 mainstream Michael J. Fox Teen Wolf, which has been done multiple times. And Teen Wolf, either I think you love it or you hate it, but it really kind of broke ground and humanized the werewolf in a lot of aspects. You now have Twilight, which, as much as I detest, really kind of draws from the principles that Teen Wolf provided, is that it's not a curse as much as it makes me different, it makes me unique, and I'm going to run with that and own it. And so that's kind of the cinematic history that I went to in with the werewolves. I know it's not nearly as comprehensive as what you guys did with your movies, but I really kind of wanted to dive in as well in kind of the origins of the werewolf, because I am, obsessed with mythology and with the occult kind of stuff there. And really, there's I couldn't find a whole lot of groundbreaking evidence and sources that stated this is where werewolves started. A lot of the Greeks had a ton of myths that revolved around humans turning into animals and turning back into humans. Primarily, there was one about a man named Lycaon, which is where we actually get the word lycanthrope, which is another name for werewolf. He served Zeus a meal, which happened to be meat from a young boy, and so Zeus was very offended by this and turned him and his two boys into wolves. And this is kind of where you start to see the wolf aspect come into things, and from there it really just kind of snowballed. Every myth that you see, there are going to be aspects where people are turning into animals, and very specifically wolves. There's Nordic folklore. It's called the Saga of the Volsungs. It tells the story of a father and a son who discovered wolf pelts. And when you wore those wolf pelts, it allowed them to become wolves for 7 to 10 days, kind of a thing, depending on what source you read. And it really became a strong European myth to the point where you can find books about how to deal with werewolves. And also, we have modern day diagnoses that talk about this crazy primal rage that really just kind of blows my mind, that something so supernatural has become so relevant in modern age.
Well, I mean, it's just so grounded in reality in a lot of ways. Yeah, like people don't literally turn into wolfmen, but they do. I mean, you do see people have these two sides of them that really makes it such an effective. Oh, I'm trying to think of the best word. It's such an effective like allegory for real life real life monsters, I guess you could say. So I love werewolf mythology for that reason, and I find it also really interesting that we have the classics. We have Dracula by Mary Shelley, or sorry, Dracula by Bram Stoker, and we have Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. But really, kind of the go-to classic novel is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Where it's not a wolf, but it is an evil man.
And that's where you said the phrase duality of man, and I think that is really where the werewolf mythos pulls a lot from. There's this dark, kind of unseen power in humans that is tied to our animal kind of roots, and left untouched, it can do a lot of damage.
You in the Wolfman in the 1941, that's actually made pretty explicit by in a conversation between Larry the Wolfman and his father, Lord Talbot, who's played by Claude Rains, who's probably the best supporting actor to ever live. He says, "It's like, oh, of course you do. Like, of course I believe Larry. I believe it's." He says it's just a metaphor for the good and evil that lives in each man, and he talks very much about how the werewolf's duality. He does, of course, doesn't believe in the werewolf till it's too late in the film, but
yep.
But they make it explicit, make that notion explicit. But I think the interesting thing about the 41 Wolfman, though, is it takes that, and that's an important part of the film, but it's also, I think, a really interesting just exploration of mental illness, because Larry spends most of the movie not sure if what's happening to him is real, and feels very much like he's going crazy. And we know, as the viewers, that it's real, but he doesn't. And so it's this real descent into madness on Larry's part over the course of the film.
And I think that's an excellent point to pick up on, because as you look through history, this idea of werewolfism is really intermingled with mental illness. You have like hypertrichosis, which is a genetic disorder which causes people to grow excessive hair. And before we knew what that was, people were associating that with werewolfism. And then you have lycanthropy, which is, again, another very rare psychological, wow, I can't talk. Maybe I'm transforming into a werewolf as we speak.
I don't think it's full moon tonight.
But it's a condition where the patient feels like they're turning into a canine of some sort, and there's this whole spectrum of mental illness that was associated with werewolfism throughout the years. So yeah, Brett, I think that's a wonderful, wonderful point to pick up on the movie. It was kind of this beginning of mental illness versus kind of werewolfism.
I don't know if you are you going to talk about the more modern Werewolf in London?
More or less that it's a fantastic movie. I didn't have any notes.
With amazing transformations.
Yes.
Well, I think it picks up on the theme even further, is because you can read a lot his Battle of Werewolf in a lot of ways is a PTSD story.
Right.
His friend dies, and he is mauled in this terrible attack at the beginning of the film, and you can really, at least to some extent, I think, read the werewolf his werewolfism as the struggle to cope with the tragedy, symbolically speaking.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's literally haunted by the ghost of his friend throughout the film.
Yeah. So it's I think it's something the werewolf stories that began to pick up on here in this film, because I've seen the 1935 film Werewolf in London, and it's not good, but it does nowhere near anywhere this kind of complexity that you start to see in 1941 with the werewolf, exploring it as a condition of, we can talk about the human mind and human nature and mental illness. I think it all goes back, I think, to the 41 film, and that's really picked up on from that point forward.
And just a few more kind of tidbits that I wanted to throw out to our audience. This idea of the silver bullet being the only way to kill a werewolf really had no place in the werewolf mythos until modern times. All of the historical research that I've done really talks about either you wear the werewolf out until it turns back into a human, which involves a lot of chasing and running, or you use herbal remedies such as wolfsbane to kind of keep the transformations in check. This idea that silver cures a werewolf or can kill a werewolf is not something that originated with the myth itself. As well as this weird rivalry between werewolves and vampires. The research that I did really didn't indicate where this began or why it began. The only thing I could find is that werewolves are tied to the moon, vampires are tied to the sun, and so somehow someone decided that they should become arch enemies.
I think the answer to that question is someone in Hollywood roughly around this time, because this is we haven't really touched on this. We keep referring to these as the Universal monster movies, but this is, aside from Marvel, basically the only other successful common in cinema universe. Like, these movies do get all interconnected as they start to make sequels, and Dracula, the Wolfman, and Frankenstein were all appear in the same films repeatedly, and Dracula and the Wolfman tend to oppose each other.
Right.
Because Larry Talbot, despite his transformations, is at heart a good person who is tormented by this curse, whereas Dracula is a evil demonic being who just wants to kill people. And I think, so as far as I can tell, that's where it starts, is basically with Lon Chaney Jr. and Bela Lugosi making some additional money in some spin-offs of their franchises.
There was a Greek myth that I found which talked about when a werewolf dies, sometimes it will be resurrected as a blood-sucking undead kind of monster. And so they thought that maybe they, being the people who did this research on this myth, assumed that maybe that's where the connection between vampirism and the werewolves kind of began. This monster is known as a revenant in Greek mythology.
Well, that's pretty cool. So going back to the shared film universe thing, one thing I thought was just so interesting about that is that they had to keep having retcons, like, oh no, they didn't actually die. oh no, they didn't actually die for this sequel, and so they had to do that a whole bunch to make all of that work.
Oh, Lord knows it. My favorite of these movies is actually not like I think it's House of Dracula. That's the first one maybe where they start to cross over. I don't remember this point off the top of my head. But my favorite one where they do all cross over is actually not a horror movie. It's Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which is a genuinely funny film to this day. And comedies don't tend to age well, but Abbott and Costello genuinely do. And it's hilarious, and you've got Bela Lugosi and Lon Chaney Jr. And it is not Boris Karloff, but the gentleman who took over the Frankenstein role from him. I can't remember his name. All in it, just acting their hearts out, while Abbott and Costello are being, their usual hilariously ridiculous selves. And I think it's the best point in which they're all on screen together.
Yeah, and then, kind of from there, we see that the Hammer series of monster films kind of tried to replicate that Universal success and having crossovers and multiple sequels and all of that. And we'll have to go into the Hammer films at some point in the future, but I find it interesting that even though those were relatively successful films, they didn't scratch anywhere near the level of success or fame as the Universal crossovers did.
I do wonder how much of that has to do with the fact that that's in the 60s, I think, when that happened, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, mostly in that.
Yeah.
Time period.
It's people, at that point, a lot of the people who were kids when Bela Lugosi and Frankenstein were terrified, were doing their later films in the 40s and 50s. I guess mostly in the 40s. I think it eked over into the 50s. Yeah, they're the people. So it's like, this Christopher Lee, he's a good vampire, but he's no Bela Lugosi. It's kind of like, when they keep doing remakes today, and it's like everyone's like, why would you remake that movie? The first one was perfect because everyone grew up on that one. And I wonder how much that hurt the Hammer films. Is that basically everyone who was middle aged and the people with disposable income were like, yeah, I grew up on Bela Lugosi. He's no Bela Lugosi.
Yeah, been there, done that.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas like now you could make a Dracula film and you have a little more freedom because we're a long time since there was a great iconic Dracula. Apologies to Gary Oldman.
Well, maybe someday we'll get the Dracula film that satisfies me.
I saw an interesting take one time that says the reason it's never been adapted particularly well from book to screen is because it is a slow burn book. And there's just no way to turn a letter-based slow burn book into a movie. And I don't know if that is true, but I do wonder if the format of the book makes it just hard to turn into a movie.
Yeah, I would say that's fair because really the closest thing that we have to a book with that format, where it's made up of letters and diary entries would be, maybe found footage. And I don't know if that would translate particularly well into a Dracula film without, modernizing it and all that. And I don't feel like it really works as well in a modern age. So,
I could see it. I think that'd be an interesting way to modernize it. I think.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds, kind of like American Horror Story in the Roanoke season, which was all found footage, where the second half of it was a found footage film, and the way they did it was by just making it explicitly like whereas the first part of the film of the season was all reenactment, so like all the ghosts were kind of debonair and everything or whatever. Everything is just straight up horror on the found footage because it's like, yeah, no, in real life this would be terrifying. And I think that'd be a good, if you ran with that notion, I think you might be able to turn Dracula into a properly horrifying film with found footage. You just gotta leave Bela Lugosi at the door, though.
Yeah.
All right, well, should we wrap this up, boys?
All right, sounds good to me. So I guess, Brett, is there anywhere that people can find you online that you would care to share? Or any projects or anything like that you'd like to plug?
Not at the moment. Best wishes to the dissertation that's finishing, but at the moment there's nothing online at the moment. Maybe stay tuned for later on, but and maybe look for me again if you'll have me back.
Oh, definitely.
We would love it.
All right, so I guess we can be found online at Scream Kings Pod on Twitter, Scream Kings Podcast on Facebook, and patreon.com/Scream Kings. Oh, and we also have our Instagram, which is also at Scream Kings Pod, which Max has done a good handful of posts about demons on, which was pretty sweet. I personally am also available on Twitter at NJDarkish.
And I am on Twitter at Crowley, Crowley, Finn, Phoen.
All right. So I guess that's it. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Brett.
Thank y'all for having me.
Yes, many thanks, Brett.
Hey, Andrew.
Hey, Maddie.
Do you like horror movies?
I sure do.
Well, did you know that most horror movies are inspired by real-life horror?
Really? Like what?
Well, take The Shining, for instance. That's based on Stephen King's real-life addictions, or The Purge, which could be our country any minute now.
Oh, and The Strangers, which is based on a real-life murder. People should be talking about these things.
Hey, guys.
Oh, hey, Producer Michael.
Hi.
Well, I hate to break it to you, but somebody already is. It's you!
That's right! We are Friday the 13th, the podcast where we talk about horror in real life and horror in media, all from an LGBTQ perspective.
Because we gay, y'all.
We are proud members of the Legion Podcast Network, and we can be found on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, or wherever your favorite podcasts are found.
And follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Come along with us on this crazy journey, and as always,
Get slayed!
Hi, I'm Chris.
Hi, I'm Robert, and we're the Film Flamers, a monthly podcast devoted to all things horror.
Well, horror and film at least, and horror adjacent.
Horror adjacent.
Yeah.
With a little bit of glitter thrown in.
There's a lot of laser-guided karma in this movie.
Yeah, because you can't do shit like that and not get some sort of comeuppance.
They're big business and big politics, right? Freiburg was big dance, but things are going to change.
Big dance.
I think I turned off Tales of Halloween because I was already sick of just, like, trash and...
How very dare you? I am a motherfucking Halloween enigma. I don't even know what to say. Shh, you don't have to make that vomity sound because all the children vomiting those snakes and scorpions and spiders will do it for you. Motherfucker.
From classics to new favorites to camp, no film is safe from dissection and laughs. Check out the Film Flamers wherever you get your podcasts.
Sweet dreams.